reverberations of the removal of the buffalo from the landscape are really immeasurable. We really don't understand what we've lost through their disappearance from the Great Plains, all throughout the Great Plains, right? Because they used to go all the way down deep into Mexico, all the way up into Canada, and from the Carolinas on one end to the Sierra Nevadas on the other. And so being able to roam these large tracts of land, we don't know what we've lost by wiping them out. I've been a buffalo rancher since I was 10 years old. I'm Hunkpapa Lakota from Standing Rock, and on my father's side. And I grew up at Standing Rock. When my parents passed away, I left and I worked in Wyoming and Montana for a long time, or with buffalo herds, most recently in Oklahoma with a buffalo herd there.
My first experience with buffalo was in Porcupine, South Dakota. That's where I learned caretaking of the buffalo from another nonprofit called Knife Chief Buffalo Nation Society. And when I first went into their buffalo pasture, which is approximately 900 acres, I got to witness for the first time in my life up close the buffalo, their presence, their energy. I'm an enrolled member of the Lipan Apache Band of Texas. I'm the CEO and founder of Texas Tribal Buffalo Project. Our mission and our goals are to reconnect Texas indigenous communities and peoples to each other as relatives, as well as connect to the buffalo or bison or Iyani, as we say in Lipan, as relative also. It started as a prayer. I was living in South Dakota in the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, along with the Oglala Lakota relatives there. I was really missing home, missing Texas, missing the land, missing my relatives. I found a pathway back home by using the Beginning Farmer and Rancher loan from USDA, and I was able to secure a small ranch here in Gonzales County in Wilder, Texas, with 77 acres and a home and all the infrastructure we needed to get started. Currently, we are up to 21 buffalo, including 6 calves that were born this year. When you look back in history and you see that horrendous photo of the mound of buffalo skulls, thousands of buffalo were taken off the land, and the devastation that happened after that to the land is a direct result of the keystone species being taken off the land.
Keystone species means that right, in an ecosystem, everything is related to everything else, right? So when you impact one species or the soil or anything that undergirds that ecosystem, you impact a whole bunch of other things. There are many bird species that we know that rely on buffalo. There are many ground-dwelling animals, many smaller mammals that rely on buffalo, prairie dogs being an example. All these species, all these different species that rely on the presence of the buffalo are negatively impacted when they're not on the landscape.
Bison were an important animal. They did a lot of things. I think we discount in a lot of cases a lot of those other animals and their interaction and the management of the people and attribute it to, it was bison. There were a lot of things bison did in conjunction with other animals. Everybody thinks elk is a mountain animal now, but elk were all over the plains. You had antelope, you had mule deer, you had lots of small rodents. And so all of those interacted to end up with what we had. And then the management of the native people with fire and hunting and that kind of thing interacted with those. To me, a keystone species is a species that has an important niche, and that niche can't be filled by anything else. So if we have a lot of diversity of species that all have maybe overlapping niches, it gets where there's not really any keystone species until some of those start going away.
Probably what I've done that's most relevant is look at response of small mammals to factors in the prairie like grazing by bison and cattle, prairie fires, and that sort of thing. And I did most of that work on Konza Prairie, which is where a lot of research, probably one of the longest ongoing research projects on bison has been going on. And so I've got to witness a lot of that research. Konza is a grassland, tall grass prairie research site. The entire Konza Prairie is divided up into treatment units that have native grazers, that would be the bison, that have cattle grazing, and have different burn treatments, different burn frequencies. And then there's what we're always happy to have in science, there's replicates of all of these. And so they've been able to, over the years, develop these long-term sampling for all these different species. Now, when I was out there as a graduate student, I was trapping small mammals. And one of the things we were looking at is how does grazing by things like bison affect small mammals compared to grazing by cattle? And turns out that some species, there is actually a difference. Deer mice, for example, prefer bison over cattle grazed areas. And that's probably more about how they graze spatially. Bison kind of create more open grazing areas, whereas as cattle kind of, pick a little bit here and there, but overall gives more of if you look at it from the side, cattle grazed compared to bison grazed areas, the cattle grazed areas look less grazed compared to the bison areas, at least in a patchy sort of way.
Buffalo, for example, they graze primarily on grasses. And so what that means for the prairie is that all the little forbs, the little tiny plants with big leaves that make up the primary biodiversity of prairies, they get to regrow. I've seen this giant animal with this big tongue, but you have a little tiny forb plant here, and their tongues are able to just go right around, almost like a precision laser focused lawnmower, where they go around that plant and they leave it in place. And so they eat the grasses and then leave all the forbs. And so the forbs with their flowers, with their biodiversity, increase the biodiversity of the plains, and therefore increase the biodiversity of the insects that rely on those forbs, et cetera, right? The birds that rely on those insects. So there's a cascading effect that they have just based on what they eat.
In tall grass prairies, for example, where you have frequent fire, you're going to have the dominant vegetation be tall grasses. And so you will, if you look in these like the catchments on Konza Prairie that are annually burned but not grazed, it's just grass everywhere you look. Across the street, you can have an area that's grazed every year, so it's grazed annually, but it's grazed by bison. Okay, so no grazing, fire every year, grazing by bison, fire every year. You look on the ground, they don't look the same at all. Literally, they're 15 feet apart. And you take people out and you say, okay, look, what do you see that's different? All grasses everywhere you look. Over here, because the bison are going out there and they're going after that dominant plant type, they are reducing that competitive advantage for those dominant grasses and allowing all those subdominant plants to come in. So you get forbs and all sorts of things. And so you get that increasing richness. And so one of the papers that you were asking about, that was one of those sites that literally you're one side of the road to the other, and what they were able to go in there and measure over that long period of time, 29 years, I believe it was that the richness of species in areas that were grazed by bison of native species just continually increased and increased and increased. Now, cattle, the same thing happened. You got an increase in richness. That's just the number of species with grazing by cattle that wouldn't have been there if the cattle grazing wasn't there. But it was less than half of what you saw for bison, which is, that to me is interesting. I wouldn't have guessed that. If you asked me, okay, are you going to see that big a difference? I would have said no, because most studies, they don't find great differences between bison and cattle.
It's different from cows and it's different from horses. The shape of their hooves aerates the soil. It brings up the seed bank. It provides the air and the space that the soil needs to be healthy and be in balance.
So they do these things called wallows where, they lay down and create these like divots in the soil. And these divots have been studied. There's greater diversity of plants that grow in those wallows. There's greater microbial communities, soil microbial communities in those wallows. And the water, when it rains, collects in those wallows, and so it provides habitat for birds as well, and any species that needs water, right? So, just by being who they are and kind of moving across the landscape that they, in the way that they do, they have a great impact on the plains ecology.
Now around here, for example, if you go and you spend time with the Texas State bison herd at Caprock Canyon State Park, you'll see them wallowing, but the soil's different here than up in Kansas, and they don't create these relatively permanent or at least persistent wallows in the ground. In Kansas, those wallows last for a long time. Not only do they last, but they hold water. And in some years, actually, chorus frogs will lay eggs in these things, and their tadpoles will metamorphose and leave them because the water lasts long enough. Not every year, but some years. The diversity of the plants around the edge of these wallows is way different than what you find in the surrounding prairie. And a friend of mine, one of his part of his graduate work was to go and look at the nutrient content, the availability in the edge of the wallow and then in the wallow and so forth. And it varies. And it's all because of where the bison are, where the plants are, and so forth.
The first thing you see when you come into the park, right before you hit the gate, is it says entering bison range. But you don't need that sign really, because when you come in this park, you can see the signs. You can see newly formed wallows around the park. You can see all of these trees. Any sign that we've got is rubbed on. They have their own sign up front. It says the official scratching post of the state bison herd, and they use it quite frequently. But they rub on all the signs. They wallow out the prairies. And you'll find their bison fibers, their hair all over the trees where they're rubbing it off, and that's a good thing, because then the songbirds can come and get it and use it for nesting material, and just the things that have occurred since we brought the bison back. And not just the bison, we also reintroduced prairie dogs into the park. So we're working to restore the native ecosystem, the natural process of things.
Prairie dogs in particular have a deep relationship with buffalo. Prairie dogs, when they set up a colony, what they do is they're like natural lawnmowers, right? They bring the grasses down and they lay them down, they flatten them out. And they do that so that they can see predators coming, in part. They can also communicate with each other easier that way. Well, when they do that, what happens is you get spurts of new growth in the grass that are more succulent, right? That are more palatable. And so the buffalo naturally follow the prairie dogs, right? They go to prairie dog colonies and they prefer to graze there because the grasses are just sweeter. It's like eating sugar. So when they do that, well, guess what? They scare away a lot of the predators that typically would come and hunt the prairie dogs, right? So there's this kind of reciprocal relationship that takes place.
A good measure of success for our conservation project is the burrowing owls. Before we reintroduced prairie dogs, there were no burrowing owls in the park. And now that we've reintroduced a population of prairie dogs, the burrowing owls have come back. And that tells us that we're on the right track, that we're doing the right things. When the native wildlife comes back on its own, you're going in the right direction.
Beavers are probably the keystone species for North America. They made a lot wetter environment out of particularly the western United States than it would have been and is now, because there isn't as many of them. When they build those dams, so they're taking out a lot of woody vegetation along those creeks. That's gonna, at least perhaps, increase flows, particularly base flows of water. They put in the dams, that slows down the flow. It backs up water. It creates a perched water table that will keep the water flowing later into the year than it would otherwise. It allows other plant species to grow. It promotes fish species that wouldn't be able to live in it. It promotes amphibians. It provides a year-round source of water that might have been just an ephemeral water course if not for that. It provides patches of fertility and moisture that are draws for a bunch of different species that they may only come there occasionally, but they need that water. You would have dry plant species, you have wet area species, and combinations of that. And so they're doing something that nothing else can do in that environment. In Everglades, alligators, kind of the same thing. When it gets dry there, they have little wallowed out areas, and that's a place where there's water and fish stay around, and muskrats and all kind of. Buffalo had a very important part to play. They ate a lot of the coarser grasses that other things would have found not particularly desirable. They would have created areas of intense grazing that would work as a fire break so that you would have patchier fires instead of it burns from the Arkansas to the Platte River and never stops. So that they had an important part to play. And at that time, they would at least border on a keystone species. In my view, we have other things now that can serve that same purpose. And again, I think a lot of the bison's effects were an effect of how they were being managed by the Native Americans also.
Bison and cattle, the big question is, are they ecological equivalents? And in a lot of ways, they're very similar. And I will tell you right now, if somebody came to me and said, hey, we're trying to manage a prairie, should we have grazing on it? I'm gonna say, yeah, you should have grazing on it, because grazing increases the diversity of most grasslands. Now, moderate grazing. If they said, well, we can't have bison, should we put cattle? I'd say, yeah, put cattle on it. Because to me, cattle are better than no grazers at all. I'm never gonna come out and say, oh, you should only have bison. That's ridiculous.
There are plenty of studies that demonstrate strong differences between cattle and buffalo. Cattle will eat pretty much anything that's out on the plains and graze it down. And cattle, just their habits of movement are very different. So not only do they decrease the biodiversity, but they decrease it tremendously because they tend to gather up in large communities, large herds, and they'll stay there and they'll just graze that grass down to nothing, right? And so the plants don't have the opportunity to regrow. And that's why if you're a cattle rancher, you have to go out and manage the herd. You have to go out and drive them somewhere else. And so a lot of this kind of like rotational intensive grazing models that people have come up with, they've come up with it for a reason, right? So my question back to these rangeland ecologists or rangeland managers is, why do you need to move the herd if they're ideal for a rangeland? Then you shouldn't need to manage them, right? If they evolved with that ecosystem, you shouldn't need to manage them at all.
Their effect on the prairie was large, and it still is, But again, if you're managing a piece of prairie, way more difficult to manage than cattle. So if you have to, if you're managing a prairie and you don't have a choice as to what what grazer you're going to use, slide a cow in there, that'll be fine. But bison are pretty amazing.
One of the issues with rewilding with bison is we got a lot of people, we got a lot of highways, we got a lot of developments around. It's a matter of, what do you want? What are you willing to do to get there?
There's many of us caretakers, both indigenous and non-indigenous, who are working so hard to restore as much as possible the traditional pathway of the Buffalo Nation. I realize that can probably never fully be recuperated, as most of the land is privately owned, but there are so many people interested in even switching over from cattle to bison caretaking. And that is so important.
With buffalo, the thing that we're kind of on the precipice of right now, that we're on the edge of trying to think about how we can restore buffalo across large landscapes, right? How can we allow the buffalo to roam once again across the landscapes that they once used to, right? With the incredible amount of fragmentation that is taking place, everybody fences their properties, right? There's a lot of cattle ranchers across the plains. Organizations are now partnering up in order to try to think about how we can either co-manage large herds and perhaps provide corridors between different properties across the plains. And if we continue to partner up in that way, across conservation agencies, across tribes, across federal agencies, if we're able to do that, we can perhaps reconnect this fragmented landscape over time, and then the buffalo will be allowed to roam once again across a large tracts of land, in which case we might actually see the fullest impact that they have on prairie ecosystems.
So Mary Ann Goodnight, she told Charles, we've got to do something about these animals. We've got to help them or they're going to go extinct. So he went out and captured 4 or 5 animals to start with in 1878 and raised them here in the Paladero Canyon area. So the animals that he started with, they were true Texas animals. He never brought any animals in outside, and he just raised Texas panhandle bison, and the animals that we have in the park are direct descendants of those animals. So it's a true Texas treasure as well as a national treasure. Fortunately, Charles Goodnight and about 4 other ranchers across the country decided they needed to do something for one reason or another, and they started conserving these bison. All bison alive today come from one of those 4 foundational herds. That's the only reason we have bison today, is because of those people that went out and started those herds. In 1902, Yellowstone was fairly new. It had only been around for a couple of dozen years or something. And the bison in Yellowstone were protected, but there was no enforcement. So those bison were just about wiped out. There were like 20 animals left in all of Yellowstone. So the National Park Service reached out to a few people, including Charles Goodnight. And so Goodnight sent 3 bulls to Yellowstone. So our genetics are prevalent in the Yellowstone herd as well. And our genetics, the Goodnight genetics, are partly responsible for saving the animals in Yellowstone. We have somewhere between 75 and 100 new calves every year. Carrying capacity is one thing, but then when you add in the park visitors, that adds another whole dynamic. Probably around 250 animals is where we want to be. So every year we're going to have lots of surplus. Since Goodnight never brought any animals in from outside, these animals' lineage is truly Southern Plains. This is the last known Southern herd. These genetics are non-replaceable. We can't go out and get any more. If we were to have a disease or a natural disaster like a big fire or something come through here and just happen to wipe out this herd, we're done, we're over. There's no more. So we're working to get multiple herds of these animals in different places to protect them better. We're not finished on the conservation of these animals. We're trying to work with other partners, whether it be tribal lands, whether it be government agencies or non-government agencies, or even private producers if we can figure out how, to get these bison out into the Southern Plains. So we can put these wonderful genetics back where they belong in the Southern Plains of the United States. Full-grown bison, a male bison, the bulls, they can weigh up to 2,000 pounds. They grow from birth till about 5 or 6 years old when they're fully mature. And that's when that's when you can see the massive heads and the massive horns. And it's just, there's no doubt when you're looking at 2 bison together, which one is the male. Their heads are so much bigger. They're twice the size of a cow. A cow can get about 1,000 pounds, which is pretty respectable itself. And you think about that, these animals that are weighing 2,000 pounds, they can also run 40 miles an hour. so they can run as fast as a horse. And the way that they're built with that big hump on the back, the hump serves multiple purposes. Mainly the one that everybody's heard about is the neck muscles that lets them just move the snow out of the way to get the grass that's covered in snow. But it also acts as a fulcrum. So if you look at a bison, you see that hump, their body is basically centered right there. So they can move a whole lot faster than people think. They can spin around and move really fast. I have seen a 2-year-old bison bull flat-footed jump a 6-foot fence with just barely even touching it going over. It's pretty amazing. We get about 80,000 visitors a year here at Caprock, and so we see people from all over the world come through here. People that are familiar with bison, people that thought bison were extinct, didn't know there were still bison. People of all different skill sets, you know, people that are good nature lovers that, you know, backpack and whatnot, people that have never been on a trail in their lives. We see the whole gamut. And we try and make it as safe as possible for everybody. Of course, there's a few things that you don't want to do. You don't want to approach the bison. You can't feed them. That goes for any wildlife. Don't approach the wildlife at all. You can't feed them. You can't leave stuff out that they'll get. You know, take care of yourself. Be responsible for what you brought in here. Leave no trace. You know, if you bring in some trash, take it back out. It's your responsibility to take care of you and your family. But a state park, any state park, is inherently dangerous. This is a wild place. You're coming into a wild area with rattlesnakes, with wild bison, with prairie dogs, and other things. So you've just got to make sure that you understand what you're getting yourself into.